The common nail clipper transformed into siege onager. Good to see you, everyone. My name is Robbie Howell. I am a tabletop game designer, a lover of history, and a lifelong player of Age of Empires 2. There is a lovely, great thunderstorm happening outside. Apologies for any booms. But speaking of booming, today we are going to be covering a civilization that I've been requested for quite a few times. A civilization that will have undeniably some of the best economic power in the game, making it very, very well suited to that namesake strategy. I am talking, of course, about the Venetians. Part 1 of an Italian subdivision. I say part 1, but it's actually more like part 2.5. I have, after all, already done videos on the Lombards and Romans, both of whom bear some similarities to the Italians, though of course the Romans have had their own time in the sun. But the Venetians should be taking this Italian source material in a very new and unique direction, and I very much hope you enjoy what we are in store for today. As always, if you want to see any disclaimers as to my process when theory crafting or my general philosophy as a game designer, please look on the screen right now. And remember, as always, that there is a comprehensive civilization document, including all of my sources, linked down in the description below. With those out of the way, let us jump into Venetian history. While Venice would make its mark on the world stage starting in around the 800s AD, its roots are several hundred years older. A Celtic people, largely called the Veneti, lived in the northeast of Italy, in the lagoony, swampy areas that we would later know to be Venice. They were vassals and citizens at many points of the Roman Empire, but once Rome began to quaver and fall as Huns and Lombards and all sorts of other marauders came rampaging through Italy, the Veneti needed to band together for protection, no longer able to rely on Roman support. And as such, they built themselves a big city in the middle of a lagoon, on top of a series of 116, I believe, different islands, which we would later know to be called Venice. This early Venice was a genuine marvel of engineering for its era and the resources available to the Veneti people, and in its early days, it weathered sieges from many marauding enemy forces, the Lombards being one of them, but also later on the Franks entered the picture under Charlemagne. They besieged Venice for almost a year and were badly beaten, showing just how strategically essential its location was. And this had not been missed by the Byzantines. Though they were out in the east, the Byzantines were meddling a lot in Italy during this time frame, what with trying to rebuild the Roman Empire and all that. And even after that failed, they still had a ton of influence. And part of that influence was founded in Venice. It was taken on as a Byzantine vassal in about 803, booting out pro-Lombard and pro-Frankish factions, and leaving it in a strong, relatively independent position, though still obligate to the empire as a whole. And from here, the Venetians would only begin to grow. No longer did they have to worry about local conflicts to nearly the same degree, and their influence and power began to spike over the next century. They became a major maritime power within 50 years of falling under the Byzantine yoke, and they would dominate all of Eastern Mediterranean trade by no later than around the 1000s AD. This started with a campaign to subdue local pirates, specifically Arabs and Dalmatian Slavs. And once those pirate populations were under control, the Venetians began to establish merchant colonies, particularly in Islamic regions. And because of this, they opened an essential door into the East, effectively linking Middle Eastern and European trade more thoroughly than it ever had been before, and profiting massively in the process. Though they accumulated enormous wealth, though, they were not without opposition. Rivals at home, such as the burgeoning Hungarian state, started by the Magyars, of course, and the Normans, who would plunder their way down into Sicily, both presented immediate problems for the Venetian navy, which was already starting to get very powerful even in these early days. Even being served a rare bad loss against the Normans in around 1080-ish AD, but this didn't stop them from retaining their large amount of hegemony over the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, this would lead us naturally into the Crusades, and the Venetians were very heavily involved during most crusading actions, but not in the way that you might think. You see, Venice didn't really want to spoil its relations with its most profitable trading partners, but at the same time, they were, Christian, I guess, and they were surrounded by tons of very ardent Christians who would have been very, very mad if they did not go fight. And so, as the Venetians often did, they compromised. They said, guys, you can't spell crusade without cruise. Let us take you there. You can pay for your passage on our excellent ships. You'll be safe from pirates, and we know the waters better than anyone else. And the Crusaders said, okay, we'll do that. And so in large part, Venice once again entered a role as a middleman during this key period of war, transporting Crusaders back and forth without too badly compromising their relations with their key trade partners. They did take some military actions, especially along the coast, especially during the First Crusade, but for the most part, they kept their hands clean of the bloodshed on the land. That is, of course, until the Fourth Crusade. And there was a lot of very, very complicated sociological issues leading up to this point, but let me try to summarize. So, again, Venice had been nominally, at least, under Byzantine rule during all of this time, but they were so much more wealthy than the Byzantines. It began to come into question who was really the master and who was really the servant. In Constantinople itself, the Venetians were often quite hated, seen as snooty and full of themselves, and this resulted in some major anti-Venetian riots that killed hundreds of people in Constantinople. In revenge, Venice did a very naughty thing. During the Fourth Crusade, they were once again playing middlemen, transporting Crusaders across, and they happened to be transporting a very large Crusader army that couldn't pay them. And so an agreement was reached. Why don't you Crusaders just kind of stop along the way and help us retake a couple of core territories that the Byzantines stole from us? They started with the city of Zara in the Balkans, and then moved on to Constantinople herself. And this leads us to the sack of Constantinople in 1204, when a massive army of Crusaders, spurred on by the Venetian masterminds in the background, wreaked havoc upon the city, joined by Venetian marines in the process. Not an enormous amount of life was lost, but the amount of wealth that was carried off was staggering. Venice profited so hugely from this one action that the power dynamic between it and Byzantium switched on its head. They became the strongest, most influential and wealthy city in the world, and Constantinople and the Byzantine Empire more broadly were reduced to a shadow of their former selves. In fact, it's even hypothesized that if this event had not happened, there is a chance that Constantinople might have been able to resist the Turks just a few hundred years later. But anyways, moving back to Venice. A whole lot happened over the next century or so. The Venetians were really hitting the peak of their power. They controlled pretty much all trade in the Eastern Mediterranean and a good amount in the West. They began to make contacts in Anatolia and the Caucasus Mountains. They also made preemptive contact with the Mongol Empire as it was trashing its way through Europe. And you know what? Unlike all the other Europeans who tried to fight off the Mongols, the Venetians bargained with them. They actually entered into a peace treaty with the Mongols and a trade agreement that gave them exclusive rights to do business with the Golden Horde as it barged its way into Eastern Europe. Not only that, but this also opened new doors that the Venetians quickly pursued. They were the first Europeans to really make their way along the entirety of the Silk Road. Marco Polo, you know who he is. He's a cheating game for a reason. And this brought them into more direct contact than Europe had ever seen before with China and India. And boy howdy did they take advantage of it. They leveraged these new trade relations even more thoroughly than before, leaving Venice in the late 12, early 1300s with a near complete monopoly on almost all products east of Greece that passed into Europe. And the amount of money they made off of this was just unfrickin' fathomable. But that being said, they did make a lot of enemies in the process, such as other Italian city-states like Genoa, which went to war with Venice on 5 different occasions between the 12 and 1300s, culminating in a grand Venetian victory. But it wasn't all happy days for Venice, unfortunately. They were embroiled in other European power struggles against the Teutons and the French, and even the Swiss got involved. The Papal States were also constantly at odds with the Venetians, with Venice almost serving as a sanctuary from Catholic persecution, leading to it becoming a flourishing center for artistic expression and possibly possibly the birthplace of the Enlightenment movement that would signal the beginning of the Renaissance era. The Venetians even fulfilled orders to print the Quran in Arabic from their Muslim trading partners. Can you imagine that happening anywhere else in Europe? I don't really think so, not during this time period at least. And yet, like all mighty empires, a decline was to come. It started in the 1400s, and why did it start? Well, Venice made a few too many enemies for its own good. There was a great alliance of European powers against them in the 1500s called the League of Cambrai. This was headed by the Papal States and was joined by France and the Holy Roman Empire and Hungary and Spain. And this great alliance, while it didn't destroy Venice by any means, it did greatly curb the influence that they were ever so gradually increasing throughout Italy and the broader European and Mediterranean worlds. But even more devastating than the League of Cambrai was the coming of the Ottomans. After the Ottomans took Constantinople, they immediately began to seize water control within the Mediterranean, bringing them into immediate conflict with the Venetians. They fought multiple times over almost 200 years, leading right up until the end of the AoE2 relevant time frame, culminating, of course, in the famous Battle of Lepanto, where the Venetians were part of a three-way alliance that destroyed a major Ottoman fleet and, for a time, curbed their influence in the Aegean and beyond. But that wouldn't mean that Venice would end the AoE2 relevant timeframe in a very strong place. By the time we reach 1600 AD, which is again where I draw the endpoint for the AoE2 relevant timeframe, Venice's monopoly on trade hung in the balance. They were constantly fighting the Turks, their European neighbors were absolutely sick of their shit, and new rivals in trade were starting to emerge. And so after the AoE2 relevant timeframe, Venice would definitely start to majorly lose what influence it had built. It would be outcompeted by the English, Dutch, etc. over the next 100 or 200 years, and would be completely curbed by Napoleon Bonaparte, who broke it up as a state forever. But even well before that, Venice started to tone back its geopolitical ambitions and began to develop a new focus as a cultural and tourism hub, which is, of course, much of what it is known for today. Venice was actually one of the very first cities in the world that tried to promote and prioritize tourism as early as the 1600s AD. And that, I think, is a very commendable and respectable conclusion to an almost 800-year-long reign of total dominance. Let's move on to some flavor, the lovely aesthetic details that make an Age of Empires civilization special. Starting with architecture, it's Mediterranean, what a surprise, with unique skins for the dock and market, very important buildings for Venice, as well as the castle as is standard. Their language would be Venetian Italian, ciao, ladies and gentlemen. Yes, the word ciao did exist during the Middle Ages and is of Venetian origin. How fitting for my videos, which always conclude with ciao for now. And their wonder would be the gorgeous St. Mark's Basilica. This lovely edifice was erected during Venice's height and is said to house the stolen remains of St. Mark, the patron of the city. In terms of some AI player names, I encourage you to take a look on screen right now if you are interested. If you want more information on all of these, please make sure to check out the civilization document linked in the description down below. And with that, let's move on to some campaigns. I was honestly kind of delighted by just how many great campaign options there were for this civilization, but as always, we need to stick with my favorite three, and then I'll give you some other potential options later on. Let's begin with Enrico Dandolo, arguably one of the greatest strategic minds of all the Middle Ages. He was a Doge of Venice, that is the head of state, the president, if you will, who came to power during the infamous Fourth Crusade in his 80s. He was blind, and though he had an incredibly successful life as a businessman and politician leading up to that point, who would have thought that this aged man would orchestrate one of the most ingenious political and military masterstrokes of the Middle Ages? Yes, indeed, he is the one who organized the sack of Constantinople, and I think an Enrico Dandolo campaign would largely follow that storyline. But it should also focus on a number of his other exploits before that infamous moment as well. It's a fairly obvious pick, and I think it would be a crowd pleaser, but there are other good ones besides. Let's take a look at Pietro Tradonico. This was an earlier Doge of Venice, ruling in the 800s AD, and he was the first of the Venetian rulers to really build up the city's navy, orchestrating much of the anti-pirate actions during this early phase of Venice's history, and a staunch ally of the Byzantines, who at this time hadn't developed nearly as much prejudice against the Venetians as they would in later centuries. Pietro Tradonico in many ways set Venice on the trajectory it would follow throughout the rest of the Middle Ages, focusing on total control of the sea and intricate diplomatic interrelationships. But there's one more we need to talk about. kind of the obvious pick to many people's eyes. Yes, we gotta talk about Marco Polo, the famous traveler who made his way all the way from Venice right into the court of Kublai Khan. While he would be a very unconventional campaign with a hero who could not fight, likely focusing on small-scale squad action where his like personal guards or whatever are fending off raiders or bandits trying to pillage their caravan in the desert, it would be such an awesome showcase of so many different civilizations, all through the lens of this one humble Italian merchant, that I don't know, I think it could be a really fun flavor-style campaign, even if it didn't have necessarily as captivating gameplay. And if it wasn't made officially, I guarantee you it would be made unofficially by some enterprising modder. Let's talk about where this Venetian civilization could slot into existing campaigns, beginning, of course, with the Sforza campaign. You fight a number of Venetian factions there, this would be an obvious pick for them. Another one, Barbarossa 4, we see a very small, shitty Venice as one of our major enemies, and also you could even add this Venetian civilization to the Bari campaign to add a little bit of variety with the existing onslaught of Italians and similar. So a couple of decent offerings, though nothing that really knocks my socks off. But what does knock my socks off, however, is just how many other awesome campaign ideas I found while I was researching the history. Let's begin with Pietro II Orseolo. This was another highly successful Venetian doge who followed largely in the steps of Pietro Tradonico. Unlike Venice would go on to be in many later years, he was actually on excellent terms with both the Byzantines and the Holy Roman Empire, and leveraged these alliances to conduct incredibly impactful naval campaigns and secure almost the entirety of the Dalmatian coast for Venice as part of its territory. He even founded a famous ceremony called the Sposalizio del Mare, which I'll be talking about a little bit later. Definitely not as good as Tradonico, though, in my opinion, at least. Another campaign option would be the Venice-Genoa Wars. These took place over, again, almost 150 years. 5 different wars, all culminating in the Battle of Chioggia, which was a spectacular Venetian victory. Even though it doesn't focus on a single protagonist, there are a lot of really interesting characters who could come into play, though I think that its main detriment is it would absolutely require a Genoa civilization to be added to the game before it could be truly done justice. Another good option, a pair of scenario protagonists, namely Agnello and Giustiniano Participazio. These two ruled just after Tradonico as a father-son dynamic duo. The first one, Agnello, was a great builder who massively increased the Venetian defenses and navy in the face of new pirate pressure, and his son, Giustiniano, was quite the hothead. He was actually the one who made that daring heist where he stole the remains of Saint Mark from a mausoleum in Alexandria and squirreled them all the way back to Venice, where they would later be enshrined in St. Mark's Basilica. I don't think either of these two men could hold a campaign by themselves, but together they make for a very cohesive and engaging storyline, in my humble opinion at least. But lastly, I want to talk about Lepanto. Obviously, Lepanto is in-game right now as a very lukewarm historical battle where you play the Spanish with a Greek ally against the Ottomans. Building a wonder. Mind-numbingly incorrect. In fact, the Battle of Lepanto was led up to by decades upon decades of intricate naval actions, primarily between Venice and the Ottomans. Lepanto itself only came to pass when the Papal States organized the Holy League in defense of the European coast against the Ottomans, which was comprised in equal parts of Papal State ships, Spanish ships, and Venetian ships. As such, I would propose Lepanto being completely overhauled into either a campaign where you play as Venice, culminating in a grand Battle of Lepanto with a bunch of allies, or, if you want to keep it as just a historical battle, make it a 3-way co-op scenario, where one person plays the Papal States, one person plays the Spanish, one person plays the Venetians, and amp it up massively. No dumb wonder. Billion more ships. This was one of the most influential naval battles in history, and it is not done justice. Rant over. Let's move on to some major themes that I identified when I was reviewing Venetian history, beginning with their unfathomable wealth and stranglehold over trade. As I have reiterated a number of times throughout this presentation already, they had a total monopoly, or at least a near total monopoly, over trade between the West and the East for several hundred years. They were absolutely irreplaceable middlemen, made their way along the Silk Road, and consolidated their wealth through some of the earliest industrial scale manufacturing in all of Europe, as well as one of its earliest banking systems. What is less known, however, is that Venice's trade might actually begin with salt. The lagoons of Venice are not necessarily the most fertile or productive areas, but one thing they are very good at is producing sea salt. And early aspiring Venetian merchants would harvest this salt en masse, sell it at great price, and use their profits to buy out or forcibly shut down their competition all throughout the entire Mediterranean. Salt was Venice's first monopoly, and they leveraged their success with it to dramatic effect over the next coming centuries. Another major theme is an obvious one: naval power. At their height, remember this is a medieval power, at their height, Venice's navy had 3,300 plus full-scale warships. What? That's unbelievable. And you know what's even more unbelievable? This was a standing navy, a permanent navy. They were the first medieval state with a permanent navy. That is unbelievable scale for what was achievable at the era. And these ships were constructed at tremendous speed in a huge dockyard within Venice called the Arsenal. It was said that the workers at the Arsenal were so efficient that they could construct a ship in the duration of a feast, which is again pretty frickin' mind-boggling. And the Arsenal was incredibly well defended, with every dock worker there trained in self-defense and coached extensively on emergency protocols to conduct if enemies were to attack or spies were to infiltrate. Venice's connection to the sea was so profound that a tradition started called the Marriage of the Sea. In this ceremony, a new doge of Venice would sail out into the middle of the Adriatic, and with prayers and singing and festivities happening on the boats around him, he would take an engagement ring and throw it into the water, representing the city's almost spiritual union with the Mediterranean Sea. Pretty profoundly beautiful when you think about it. And a third major theme I want to talk about was diplomacy. The Venetians were able to infiltrate pretty much any market they were interested in cornering, and this resulted in little Venices springing up in coastal cities all around the Mediterranean. These would be like cloistered communities with their own churches and stores and public services that were completely tolerated by local governments, not wanting to piss off the local Venetians, because during many points of the Middle Ages, a coastal city's prosperity could be attributed in large part to how good their relations were with the Venetians at the time. But this is where Venice's other great diplomatic strength came into play. They had a very business-like attitude to war in general. They did not like fighting, and as we'll see, there was a pretty good reason for this. And as such, it wasn't very common for Venice to raise armies, with the obvious exception, of course, of their massive navy. Instead, they only entered into war when it benefited them. And when they were directly attacked, they were quick to bribe and negotiate to protect themselves very extensively. In fact, when the League of Cambrai took Venice itself for the first time in centuries in the 1500s AD, the people and its structures were left almost completely intact due to the machinations of the city's leadership. This brings us to the last fascinating point of Venice that is so often overlooked. They were a republic, like an actually successful republic that had a multi-branched government, much like you see in modern republics. Yes, within that republican system, there was a lot of oligarchical favoritism and everything was pretty much controlled by a handful of very, very powerful political dynasties. But it was a really efficient government that ended up lasting longer than any republic in the history of the world ever has, well over 400 years before it was toppled. The government even frequently audited itself, setting up independent bodies to ensure there was minimal corruption and things were happening efficiently. And because of this, Venetian citizens had more autonomy as well as wealth than pretty much any medieval contemporary of the time. And that makes for a very special civilization. And what better note to bring us to the end of the history section. If that was all you were here for, thank you so very much for watching. Please make sure before you leave to like and subscribe before you go. But for all those of you who, like me, love Age of Empires and want to see what I have done with this civilization, let us move on to the game mechanics, beginning with some necessary updates. As you know, I love adding new regional units to the game, and this Venetians build is no exception, so let's begin with the Carroccio. The Italian city-states, especially after like 1200 AD, started to adopt a practice by which they would roll their city's standard into battle on a large oxen-drawn cart. This standard was seen as incredibly precious to the city and would make soldiers fight much harder, but would also lead to humiliation and very expensive ransoming if it were captured by an enemy. In fact, these standard carts ended up being used in a couple of other European powers as well, though Italy was definitely where the practice originated, and as such, I envision the carroccio being a fixture of many of the Italian states that I tackle during other subdivisions of the civilization I plan on dealing with in the future on this channel. Let's talk about the carroccio, shall we? It is ram-like in terms of its stats, but it's significantly faster and cannot attack. Additionally, you can only ever have one active on the field at once it is trained at the castle. The carroccio gives massive buffs within its line of sight. It has about a 9-tile line of sight, and it improves the rate of fire, the bonus damage given, and reduces bonus damage taken for all allied units within this area of effect. With this, I was trying to represent a more general fighting spirit buff while preserving a little bit more tactical integrity. It's a really strong effect, but it'll be even better if you're making good use of counter units, which is a theme I feel like Italian civilizations are largely going to play into well, as well as referencing the Sicilian bonus damage reduction thing, which is one of my favorite civilization bonuses in the entire game. Now, the carroccio is quite expensive. It costs 150 wood and 250 gold, and worse still, if an enemy kills your carroccio, they get 500 gold. Wow, that's devastating. But remember, the carroccio is ram-like, and as such is very resistant, not as resistant as a ram, but very resistant to ranged attacks. And since it's fairly fast, you're mostly going to have to worry about it getting swarmed by something like enemy heavy cavalry. So it's a very strong unit, make sure you don't lose it, and it would also be gained by the existing Britons, Italians if we were to keep them, and the Magyars, all of whom used these standard carts fairly extensively, as well as my builds for the Lombards and Swiss, who were also known to use this unit. Let's move on to the second unit that I want to talk about here, namely the catapult galley. At some point, I'm going to stop mentioning this in my builds because it's just becoming so pervasive. For those who haven't seen it yet, the catapult galley is my suggestion for a new common unit that would be a pre-gunpowder replacement for the cannon galleon. It was originally a unique unit on my Vandal build, and is now available to a wide variety of civilizations, almost half the ones currently in the game. It's available in Castle Age, unlike the Dromon. I did come up with this before the Dromon was out, and I think the Dromon is a step in the right direction, but is not brilliantly designed, in my opinion, so the Catapult Galley is seeking to redress a lot of my grievances with that unit, and as such, it's available in the Castle Age, and is much like a weaker Cannon Galleon. It's cheaper, though, quicker to create, better blast radius, and the Venetians uniquely improve their catapult galleys to cannon galleons automatically after they research chemistry. Normally, the catapult galley has an elite upgrade for the Venetians. They just get them cannon galleons instantaneously. Very, very powerful, and reinforces how good the Venetians are on water. The catapult galley is cheaper than a cannon galleon at 150 wood, 125 gold. And now, let us move on to an overview of the civilization. The Venetians, an economy and naval civilization. First bonus, passively gain resources at a rate of 1% current stockpile per minute. That means if you have 100 stone in your stockpile, then every minute that passes, you gain 1 more stone. Doesn't sound like very much, but this applies for the entirety of the game, for all of your resources, no matter what. And at my very, very rough calculations, on average, if you are trying not to float resources, this is still going to result in you getting somewhere in the range of 300 to 600 resources over the course of an entire game. That being said, you can also play into it. You can try to not spend your resources and as such get more in the long run. It's a really interesting trade-off, and while it's a very subtle bonus, it is going to be one of the defining elements of the Venetian playstyle, and is obviously in reference to their massive trade and banking sectors. The rich just get richer, and the Venetians are a perfect illustration of that. Second bonus, upon aging up, each dock spawns a galley. This one should be fairly self-explanatory as well. The Venetians took naval control incredibly quickly, developing some of the most effective shipbuilding techniques of the entire era and seizing the seas before any of their rival powers could contest them. It's going to be an incredible bonus on water maps and might even encourage you to build more than one dock before you hit feudal age to get a nasty timing attack. Third bonus, the map's edge can be traded at with 33% efficiency. What does this mean? Imagine every edge tile of the map, the black tiles, was a market. And you can task your trade cards to go trade with them as though they were a market. However, they'll only be working about a third as efficiently as they would with a real market in terms of the distance to gold ratio that you're going to get. This is, again, obviously in reference to Venice trading with the farthest flung corners of the world. It was able to access China and India and all those different awesome places and blow its competition out of the water with its access to rare resources. And because of that, there is no game in which the Venetians cannot establish trade. Going to be useful, probably most so in post-imperial scenarios or on maps where trade lines are very vulnerable, cluttered, or tough to set up. Fourth bonus, if a building's rally point is set on itself, it will train military units instantly at an additional cost. This one is tricky, and the grounding behind it is fairly interesting. Like I said, Venetians didn't like to fight. They were used to a high standard of living and were Republican citizens, but when they did need to fight, they had one of the most efficient conscription systems that the Middle Ages ever saw. They were not only able to outfit their men with some of the highest quality, best made weapons and armor that money could possibly buy, but they also had a system by which only 1 in 10 men would be drafted for war, and the other 9 who weren't drafted would have to pay for the one's gear. This made it so that everyone contributed to warfare and not everyone was sent to die in a meat grinder. The way this bonus works is that for every second a unit's training time would normally take, doing this instant training time mode will increase their cost by 2%. So to give an easy example, if we look at a knight that has a 30-second training time, if you try to train it instantly, its cost, both food and gold, would increase by 60%. This is quite expensive and will add up quickly, but will allow you as Venice to not only launch, again, devastating timing attacks on land or water, this does apply to ships as well, but it will also allow you to muster defenses in a pinch if you need to. And will hopefully make it feel a lot less bad that you're floating so many resources to take advantage of your stockpile bonus. Let's touch upon the team bonus now. Loaded trade units, namely those that have gold in them, spawn temporary defenders whenever they are struck. This ability has a 10-second recharge, but the spawned unit has a 30-second timed life and does not take population space, meaning that if your enemy is trying to raid your trade line, even when they do get a hit on one of your carts, it's going to be popping out guys to protect itself all over the place. Trade carts will always spawn a spear line unit with whatever upgrades the source player currently has, while trade ships will always spawn a fire ship. This will obviously make trade lines incredibly difficult to disrupt for the Venetians, and is in reference to the fact that their seizing of water control in the Mediterranean was explicitly to facilitate trade, and all Venetian caravans, whether on ocean or on land, were heavily guarded, protected by an elite entourage that would escort them to and from their destination point and fend off pirates and other trouble. Let's take a look at their unique units now. Venice has 3 unique units, beginning with their castle unit, the Arsenalotto. This is a heavy infantryman costing 40 food and 30 gold. The Arsenalotti were the dock workers of the famed Venetian arsenal, able to build ships at enormous speed, but also taking up arms to defend the arsenal whenever it was under attack. Venetian armies would often bring Arsenalotti with them to serve as frontline troops with their large shields and big warhammers, thanks to their consistent military training and enormous strength of arms. This unit, the Arsenalotto, is a very beefy but fairly low damage infantry, kind of like an obu. It has attack bonuses versus gunpowder and ships, and both of these are substantial, by the way, so it's almost like a condottiero in that regard. It also takes substantially reduced damage from enemy gunpowder attacks. So while it's not as fast as a condottiero would be, and therefore can't catch up to gunpowder units as easily, it is way harder for them to take down. Lastly, Arsenalotti can garrison inside of a dock to boost its work rate. This can be done at any time, and for each individual Arsenalotto inside of a dock, its work rate increases by 10%, 15% for elites. This means that your docks, even if you're not using the rally point trick, can be spamming out ships at a colossal rate if you are making use of Arsenalotti, and can allow them to be quite useful on island maps even before you send them out to land on enemy shores. A very versatile unit that, while I don't think will be a backbone of the Venetian army, I think will be a useful supporting troop that they break out from time to time. Let's move on to their next unique, the galleass. Most famed of all Venetian warships, the galleass combined elements of the rowed galley with new masted ships that were starting to appear in the Mediterranean during the height of Venice's power, and made for a really versatile hybrid weapon platform and offered absolutely tremendous firepower due to it being outfitted with, again, the best weapons that money could buy. Like the galley, which it upgrades from, the galleass costs 90 wood and 30 gold, it replaces the war galley from Castle Age. It has all the same benefits as the normal war galley upgrade would, but also galleasses fire 2 additional shots, each of which do a fixed 2 damage, kind of like a Hussite wagon or an organ gun in a tight cone in front of itself. The galleass also has higher melee armor as well as a higher rate of fire. Since Venetian sailors were well trained in naval actions, very good at resisting enemy boarding actions, and every single Venetian sailor was armed and proficient with a crossbow, hence the extra shots and the heightened rate of fire, and allowing the galleass to absolutely chew through enemy ship fleets, even the deadly fire ship that normally counters them. It also upgrades to the Grand Galleass in Imperial Age, which does everything it does, but even better still. A devastating water unit that will probably single-handedly make the Venetians a top-tier water civilization. Lastly, let's talk about the Argosy. This is an upgrade to the trade cog in Imperial Age and retains its cost. Argosies were nimble merchant vessels used in Venice and the Dalmatian coast, and were known for both their speed and their relative durability, almost always outfitted with heavy weaponry to resist random pirate attacks if they weren't being escorted by a larger convoy. The Argosy as such is substantially beefier than a normal trade cog, and enemies that attack it within 6 tiles will automatically be shot back at. The Argosy cannot be tasked to attack, but it will defend itself instead. And its attack is nothing to sneeze at. It's just a little bit weaker than a galleon, and of course has lower range. More notably, the Argosy will defend itself even while it is moving, making Venetian trade lines even harder to deal with if they are focusing as they should on the water. A really interesting, unique unit that reinforces a lot of the rest of the strategies that I'm sure you see starting to crystallize for this Venetian civilization. Let's round off this overview with their unique technologies, beginning with their Castle Age one, Sposalizio del Mare, the marriage of the sea. I talked about this earlier. It was iconic to Venice throughout much of the Middle Ages, and it will make all eco ships cost minus 50%. That's enormous. This is both fishing and trade ships, by the way. And in addition to this, all ships, not just eco ships, regenerate 75 hit points per minute while idle. They can't be moving or attacking. Venice was irrevocably tied to the sea. The Venetians almost worshipped the sea and trusted it beyond any other ally they would have, and as such, the sea will shelter Venetian ships that come to her for comfort. It's not going to be an essential technology in terms of military action on the water, but it will give your water economy a tremendous bonus, while also providing some useful incremental benefits, especially if you manage to retreat a fleet to reheal themselves at rapid rate when they are not under fire. Let's move on to their Imperial Age unique technology, Scuole Grandi. Guilds dominated Venice throughout pretty much the entirety of its duration as a power. And many of these guilds got so strong, they actually orchestrated a lot of state functions, like hospitals and charities, and even training commissions to get homeless people off the streets and into good jobs in one of these guilds' workshops. This technology as such functions as a souped-up guilds, which the Venetians do lack, by the way, and also allows all of your markets to train villagers, representing the guilds getting more workmen out into the system at remarkable pace. Wow, what a technology. If you can do a fast Imperial Age with the Venetians, then their boom can be unfrickin' paralleled because of this technology. Once again, reinforcing their identity as an economy civilization first, with the Navy being an incredible ace up their sleeve when they need it. As always, make sure to check out the civilization document down in the description for full details on all of these bonuses. With this being covered, let's move on to an overview of the Venetian tech tree letter grade style, beginning with their infantry. It is a B. They have the Arsenalotto, which is quite useful, but they miss militia, as well as champion. How this works is that they still have to research the technology to get men at arms, but can't train any sword line unit until they do so, completely scuppering any chance of a drush. They also miss a whole bunch of barracks technologies, supplies, arson, gamisons, and they miss blast furnace. So all in all, while their halberdiers will still be pretty decent and the Arsenalotto will have a nice role as a counter unit, infantry is normally not what you want to be doing as the Venetians. In fact, in retrospect, I might put this as a B-. I should note, by the way, that the infantry do benefit from their rally point bonus, which is going to help, especially in terms of, for example, spamming out a ton of halberdiers if you need them really, really quickly, since you're just spending more food and wood, which typically aren't very precious, and the units aren't very long to train in the first place. But this rally point bonus applies to all military, not just for the infantry. Archers, it's a B. They have fully upgraded arbalesters, and that is very, very tasty. They also have hand cannoneers, but they miss the elite skirmisher, as well as the heavy cavalry archer, and that stings. Much like the infantry, they have a couple of high points, but it can't be said that the Venetian archer tree doesn't have serious flaws. Though again, rally point bonus, that's very nice. Cavalry. It's a B. Once again, you might once again think a B- is better here because much like they miss militia, they also miss scout cavalry, which works in the exact same way, by the way. They can get light cavalry, they just have to upgrade it first. But this means that a scout rush is completely off the table, and they lack blast furnace, though their paladins are otherwise fully upgraded. So cavalry are a decent option, especially in late game, and their knights, by the way, are very good. That rally point bonus allowing you to train knights instantly if you pay a lot can make or break an early knight rush and will make that one of the Venetians' best aggressive strategies. I think a B is fair for this. Siege, it's a B-. They lack capped ram, stuck with battering ram, and they lack siege onager, but they do have bombard cannons with siege engineers, so how bad can that be? Next, defenses, it's an A-. The Carroccio is a great defensive unit, though of course you can take it offensive as well, and they have a perfect university. Additionally, their rally point bonus is, I'm guessing, going to be a bit better on defense than on offense, though I think it will be useful for both. So overall, while I wouldn't say that Venetians are an essentially defensive civilization, you're often going to play them that way so that you can focus on their boom. And speaking of their boom, economy. It's an A. It's very, very good. They do lack a bunch of late game economy technologies, but that doesn't really matter when you have so many awesome economic benefits at your disposal. Scuole Grandi gives them one of the best booms in the game. Sposalizio del Mare lets them have really, really good water economy that doesn't miss a single upgrade. And of course, they have their free resource trickle and trade with the map edge, with trade lines that are incredibly resistant to disruption. Overall, it's a great economy. You probably can't go wrong playing the Venetians in a pocket position in a team game. Levies, it's a C+. Missing elite skirmisher kind of sucks, and they also lack blast furnace for their hussars and halberdiers, but most importantly, they don't have conscription. You need to rely on their rally point bonus if you're going to get units out fast. They do have a lot of good resources at their disposal and have a great economy, but the individual levy units themselves all have flaws, and as such, I'm giving their levies a C+ in total, though I do think in post-imp scenarios they will do fine. Their dock. It's an A+. It's one of the best in the game. The Galleass, Grand Galleass, they have the Catapult Galley, which I forgot to list. They have the Arsenalotto, which has a lot of utility on water maps. The Argosy is very good on water maps to establish a really robust trade line. And they have Sposalizio del Mare, as if all of that wasn't enough. Plus, they have a perfect dock. The age-up bonus and even the rally point bonus is super relevant on water because of how long it normally takes to train ships and how much a single ship can make the difference in a naval engagement. One of the best water civilizations in the game. I'd be shocked if they weren't top 3. Lastly, monks. It's a D. It's really ugly. I'm just going to let the slideshow play all the technologies they miss. The Venetians were not known for their piety. A few of them definitely were, but they definitely were far from integrated into the broad-reaching theocracy of the era, and as such, just makes sense for their monks to suck. Probably you should never make these unless you absolutely have to. Let's move on to the Venetians' playstyle now that we have an idea of their tech tree in mind. How would they look in practice? Well, in the early game, you get a little bit of eco bonus from your resource accumulation, but you lack some really important rushes. You don't have Drush or Scout Rush at your disposal, have to rely on either subpar men-at-arms or, most usually, archers. Their archers are actually really good because not only do they become fully upgraded arbalesters in late game, but you can also train them instantly if you really need to, and that can be very, very helpful with a unit like the archer that so requires being massed up. Mostly, though, as the Venetians, you're probably going to want to play defense and boom because your real strength lies in late game. Unless you're on the water, in which case your early navy is great and just keeps getting better. Build a couple of docks before you hit feudal age if you can, so you can get a sudden rush of galleys and then train more at enormous speed with your instant production rally pointing bonus. Mid-game, you have a better eco than in Dark Age, that's for sure, and your knights and crossbows are both fully upgraded and legitimately threatening thanks to your rally point bonus. Your water dominance only gets better. The Galleass is very, very strong in Castle Age. You have Sposalizio del Mare, Catapult Galley, Arsenalotto. I've already talked about all of this. Their water play is going to be disgusting at pretty much every stage of the game. But in late game, on maps besides water, you do have some really solid power units at your disposal. Your paladins are nearly perfect. Your arbalesters, bombard cannons, and hand cannoneers are all perfect. And on water, of course, Grand Galleass, that thing's going to chew enemies up. You also have a really good strategy at your disposal for late game, namely a fast imp into boom, especially on closed maps like Arena. This is going to catapult you into the late game, let you pick up Scuole Grandi, and absolutely cover your side of the map in villagers. It's going to be one of the best ways that the Venetians can use to get to the late game and start capitalizing on their later power. Lastly, I would be remiss to mention that the Venetians are, again, very strong in teams, especially in the pocket position, where they can build up a massive eco while facilitating uncrackable trade lines and backing everything up with perfect arbalesters. A really good team civilization that I could see being a staple in that format. Lastly, let's round off the build with some loose threads, some ideas that didn't quite make the build or were unanswered for me by the time that I had finished it, beginning with some uncertainties. The Condottiero. I had plans to include a Condottiero revamp as a regional unit for this build, but I was running out of time and really couldn't find a way that I was happy with implementing it. Rest assured, this will happen in future Italian builds. I just couldn't do it for this one, and when I do figure it out, it's going to go here, I promise. The Venetians use Condottieri all the time. Secondly, I was really strongly considering saving the Galleass unit for a major dock rework. While the Venetians are most famous for their use of Galleasses, the ship did find its way into navies all over Europe, and similar ships exist well beyond, so I didn't really want to make it exclusive to the Venetians, but for the purposes of this build, I think it's fine. Much like the Catapult Galley, I could see it starting as a unique unit for them, then becoming more broad-reaching, with them having some sort of unique bonus for it. Lastly, I know you don't have to tell me. I promise I know slinging would be broken in half with this civilization. They would be one of the best slinging civilizations in the game, second only to the Novgorodians that I made. Go check them out here if you'd like. But I would push back on that being a problem with the design. I think it's more a problem with slinging as a mechanic. I do have plans in future to make a video talking about slinging and how it could maybe be fixed, but I don't want to change part of this build because part of the game was built broken, okay? Let's move on to some tabled ideas. Some of these very nearly made the build. For example, the idea of dock techs being available an age early, or maybe the first dock tech you research per age being cheaper and faster to do. This obviously evolved into the free galleys thing, which I think is a little bit cleaner, but both of these were strong considerations for me. Another one, the map edge trading. What if the unit that you sent to trade with the map edge vanished for, I don't know, 30 seconds or something, and then came back full of gold? That could kind of represent it journeying to foreign lands or whatever. I thought that was a cute idea, but it ended up feeling a little too complex in practice, and the map edge trading I thought was already pushing the boundaries enough. Another one, Sport del Mare. One of my ideas for it was maybe making it such that every time you built a dock, it gave you some free eco ships that didn't take population space. That would have been very, very spicy, but it ended up feeling a little busted to me, and I think that the incarnation I went with now is a little bit more well-rounded and versatile. This bonus was on the build up until my last draft. The idea that you can tribute an enemy resources to force them into a temporary ceasefire with you. I loved this bonus so much. It was such a cool way to represent the Venetians' diplomacy and how they played people against each other. But man, was it complicated. I really want to try to do something like this in future with a civilization build. It was going to be this one, but alas, my friends, I was not equal to the burden. Another one, what if your town center took on all the functions of a market? Or maybe a university as well, like some sort of consolidation of buildings between those three. Or maybe making it so that town center, market, university technologies all give villagers bonus work rate, but they miss other eco technologies to compensate. That was fun for me to play with for a little while, but I kind of liked the idea of the Venetian economy really relying on getting a shitload of resources and then just having the dividends pay for themselves, rather than boosting the work rates of the villagers themselves per se. Both work, but I prefer the strategic intricacy of the bonus I ended up going with. Another one, armor upgrades researched instantly. Boring, just was very, very dull. Let's go on to some unique unit options. One, the Bailo. This was the overseer of a little Venice, almost like a local governor for one of these regional enclaves. And this would be a non-combat unit that could temporarily make nearby eco units and buildings invulnerable. This also fell into the vein of that ceasefire idea I had, but was focused around a unit, which I thought maybe would make it a little more balanced, and would also not be anywhere near permanent, a little bit easier to play around, that sort of thing. Just didn't really manifest. I already had 3 unique units I was really sold on. 4 would definitely be too much. Another one, the Schiavone. This was a type of Slavic Balkan mercenary unit, famous for its use of a basket-hilted broadsword and often using a pistol. I thought it could be cool, but I didn't really want to give them a unique unit that was explicitly of a non-Venetian ethnicity. It always kind of rubs me the wrong way when civilizations do that. And the word Schiavone literally means Slav in medieval Venetian Italian, so I wanted to go with something a little bit more flavorful. Another unique unit, the Fanti da Mar. This was a type of levied marine. That would be a very cheap trash unit that in some way interacts with or boosts transport ships, like getting a boost when they're unloaded from a transport or letting a transport ship attack. Cool idea, but the Arsenalotto is just so much better. And some unique technologies. One, Camera Frumenti. This was the first incarnation of the Venetian banking system way back in the earlier days of the Republic, and this would let you get a dividend off of all other player villager gathering, like a big one, like 10%, but they also get a smaller dividend off of yours. In team games or group games, this would be spread out across all other players on both fronts, so you're not getting like absolutely disgusting amounts of resources. And this bonus was, at one point, a civilization bonus for the Venetians. I kind of like it better as a unique technology, because that way it doesn't kick in from the beginning of the frickin' game and accelerate everything to a ridiculous degree, but I do kind of like the idea. Lastly, for unique technologies, Pelago Limena. This was a kind of ship tactic where galleasses were strapped together to create an impenetrable line, and I saw it as being like an armor boost based on the number of other ships around a given ship. Kind of like what I did with Guaizema on the Jurchens build. Go check that out if you haven't already. Lastly, before we round off, I strongly considered giving Venetians access to the Saltern building that I did on my Soninke build, previously called the Ouagadugans. Go check them out here if you haven't seen them already. The Venetians were obviously famous for their salt industry. It's how they started their economic dominance, and I do really like the idea of the Saltern being more available to other civilizations, but like I said, this civilization was getting kind of complicated, and I didn't want to make it even more so. So much like I said with the Condottiero, let's save this Saltern implementation for a later draft or civilization. And with all that, we come to the end of this Venetians build. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed. Before we leave, let's take a look at the good old likeliniometer. In my opinion, how likely is it that the Venetians as a civilization, perhaps looking a little bit like the design you see here, could be added to the game in the future? And on the likeliniometer for the Venetians, we have an 8.5 out of 10. If the likeliniometer was meant to show how deserving a civilization was, it would be a solid 10 out of 10. The Venetians were one of the most impactful, dominant, intricate, well-documented civilizations of the entire Middle Ages, and the fact that they are bundled in with the frickin' Italians right now is a crime against history. That being said, I don't think that the devs are eager to do another European DLC anytime soon. There's plenty of people who really want to see more areas of the world represented, but I think that when we do go back to Europe, the Venetians and an Italian subdivision more broadly is very high on the list of priorities, with the Venetians being arguably the most important among all of them. I could even see them being added to the game without a full Italian subdivision. They're so important. But that's just what I think. Now I want to hear what you guys think. How'd you like my build? Do you think that I referenced the history well? Is there anything you think I missed? Any balance elements you think are completely off? What would you do differently more broadly? And most importantly, what would you like to see me do next on the channel going forwards? But until then, my name is Robbie Howell. Make sure to join the Discord down in the description below if you haven't done so already. And ciao for now.